Hi, Sebastian.
Hi, Bob. How you doing?
I can't complain. How are you?
Doing all right. Yeah.
All
Thanks for
right.
having me.
Oh, my pleasure. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter. This is a Nonzero podcast. You are Sebastian Strangio, author
Correct.
of a book we're going to discuss. In the Dragon's Shadow is the title. The subtitle is Southeast Asia in the Chinese Century. Very interesting book. Published by Yale University Press, but it does not, and I say this as a compliment with all due respect for academics, it does not read like an academic book. Now, maybe one reason is that you're basically a journalist, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
And that's how you got interested in Southeast Asia, I guess, in your role as journalist. Did it start off with you moving to Southeast Asia for other reasons, or did business bring you there? I mean, you're from Australia, right? Which is in the neighborhood.
Yeah. I'm from Australia, despite my accent, which is, listeners might detect a bit of an American twang. I mean, my parents grew up in the States and but they've lived here for many years.
Mm-hmm.
I got interested in Southeast Asia. I went to take a job at a newspaper called the Phnom Penh Post in Cambodia. And I ended up spending 8 years living and working in Cambodia as a journalist. So I covered, local politics and events, but I also began traveling around the region and to many other parts of Southeast Asia, particularly, where, I worked as a journalist, freelance for a good portion of that time. And, a lot of the reporting that went into the writing of this book, I conducted sort of from 2011 to 2020. That was sort of that decade.
Okay.
But yeah, I first came in contact with Southeast Asia from the perspective of a journalist.
Uh-huh. And it's a really interesting book. For one thing, it turns out that Southeast Asia is kind of a very good vehicle to use for thinking about the broader issues raised by America's evolving relationship with China. Kind of all the basic questions, it seems to me, that keep coming up and people keep arguing about, who have different views about how we should manage our relationship with China, how menacing China is or isn't, what is or isn't menacing about it, and so on. These questions come up with Southeast Asia too. So I want to get into all this. Why don't you start out by telling us what you mean by Southeast Asia? I think if it hadn't been for the Vietnam War, a lot of Americans would have no idea what you mean when you say Southeast Asia. Wouldn't even think of it as a neighborhood. I mean, that's certainly the first context in which I heard the term Southeast Asia. But you're talking about neighborhood kind of much broader than the immediate environs of Vietnam, right?
Right. I mean, Southeast Asia is a very modern concept. In fact, you mentioned the Vietnam War. It was precisely the Cold War that really created the concept of Southeast Asia. It had been in use previously. The first time its use becomes prominent is during the Second World War, when the Allies had a Southeast Asia command. Of course, it was based in Sri Lanka, then Ceylon. It wasn't based in any part of what we would today recognize as Southeast Asia, but it really is, obviously all of these regions are, like nations themselves, artificial constructs. But today, Southeast Asia it has a generally recognized boundary. I mean, it consists of 11 nations, 10 of which are included within the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is a regional grouping, sort of akin to the European Union, but a lot looser and more fluid. And so, I can list the nations. I mean, we've got Vietnam on the mainland part of Southeast Asia that is territorially contiguous with China. Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Thailand. And then in the maritime region of Southeast Asia, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Brunei, and then also Timor-Leste, or East Timor, which gained its independence in 2002, which is the one nation that remains outside the Association of Southeast Asian Nations.
Okay.
So, in a weird way, Southeast Asia sort of came about as the sort of negative space around between other more firmly defined regions. And it's taken a little bit of time for the idea of a Southeast Asian identity to emerge, but it has gradually started to emerge. because of ASEAN's emergence as a regional bloc, and Southeast Asians beginning to conceive of their nation, their region as a positive, concrete, cohesive thing rather than simply the space between other more firmly defined regions.
And is there that kind of regional consciousness to a considerable extent?
A certain extent. I mean, it is, again, a very sort of art, like, what does it mean? Southeast Asia, it is a geographic descriptor. So, it really, the region includes an enormous amount of diversity in terms of political arrangements, social structures, religion, ethnicity. On virtually every metric, it's one of the most diverse regions in the world. And so, there are some commonalities. The region's history, post-colonial history, and its history of encounter with Western power. We can talk a little bit about that because that's important in relation to China. There are things that bind the region together. I think that governments in the region today have a similar sort of view about how they see regional order and the need for, the ASEAN way of diplomacy, which is all about negotiation and this sort of constant process of diplomatic intercourse. But it is a weak sense of identity. I don't think you could talk to a person in the street in Jakarta or in Bangkok and that they would say, yes, I'm identify as Southeast Asian before Thai. I think in many places, even people would identify with their province or region or island in the case of some of the maritime nations, even before the nation. So it is a fragile construct.
Yeah. Let me back up just a little and ask you about your entry point to all this Cambodia, which is such an interesting country because, for one thing, something so horrific happened there. And that in turn is connected to, ultimately it's connected to China, and it's also connected to kind of, the entry point of American consciousness to Southeast Asia, as I mentioned, the Vietnam War. Sure. And of course I'm talking about the Cambodian genocide. I mean, what is it? A fourth of the population was murdered by the country's leader or something?
Yeah, the estimates vary. The figure that's often used is 1.7 million out of a population of 7 million. So I think it's around a quarter.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of controversy about those figures, and it's spawned a voluminous academic debate. But needless to say, it was an absolutely horrific period in the country's history and left an incredibly deep mark on the present.
And so this was Pol Pot, and are that how tangible is the legacy of that in the country?
Cambodia is a very young country now. So, the majority of the population is not only born since the end of the Khmer Rouge period in 1979, but since the end of the country's civil war. A large percentage of the country's population was born since the end of the country's civil war in the late 1990s. So, if you visit Cambodia today, it's not immediately apparent that this was a country that experienced genocide. I mean, obviously, once you start talking to older people and sort of digging beneath the surface, go out to rural areas and you see Buddhist pagodas where there are piles of skulls encased in reliquaries and other monuments. Obviously it has left a profound effect. It also, one other effect is that the government that was placed in power after the overthrow of the Khmer Rouge in 1979 is still the government that's in power today. And so the political legacy of the Khmer Rouge has factored into Cambodian politics in interesting ways. And of course, when it comes to Cambodia's relationship with the United States, this history remains very much alive in the memory of Cambodian leadership, including Prime Minister Hun Sen, who has been Prime Minister since 1985 and who both fought for and against the Khmer Rouge and helped to topple them from power in 1979 with the help of the Vietnamese military. But yeah, I mean, it is the legacy is profound, and it as I said, it really does factor into the very frosty relationship between Phnom Penh and Washington at the moment.
Because we are held responsible for that, or?
Well, so there's a number of factors. I mean, it's American involvement sort of writ large, right? So America, intervened in Cambodia. There was a large-scale carpet bombing campaign, which some people hold to be partially responsible for creating the conditions that allowed the Khmer Rouge to come to power.
This was toward the end of our involvement with Vietnam. We were it was a way to kind of cover remind us, like the bombing. I think this may be the thing where the Henry Kissinger quote is get anything that flies to bomb anything that moves. I think that was in reference to Cambodia.
Right. William Shawcross's book, Sideshows, it's fantastic on this question. It was basically, the war had spread into Cambodia. Vietnamese insurgents were using, Ho Chi Minh Trail went through the eastern provinces of Cambodia. And the Cambodian leader at the time, Prince Norodom Sihanouk, who was overthrown in a coup in 1970, he sort of tacitly permitted the transporting of communist supplies by sea into Cambodia and then into South Vietnam. He was obviously in a very difficult position at the time, but he figured that the communists would win and that he needed to be on their side.
And the supplies were coming ultimately from Russia sometimes and from...
I'm not an expert on this.
Okay, we don't need to go too far, but they were... Anyway, because both China and Russia were communist, and I'm a little confused and their relationship changed over the years. But anyway, so we did this bombing in one of the last gasp attempts, I guess, to kind of either salvage the situation in Vietnam or at least kind of slow down the inexorable loss as we got out or whatever.
I was going to say probably more important from the perspective of the current leadership is what happened after the Khmer Rouge were driven out of power.
Okay.
Cambodia was liberated, of course, by the Vietnamese communists. It was Vietnam's communist movement and the Khmer Rouge had once been sort of fraternal allies. But in the early 1970s, a faction of radical nationalist Cambodians, including Pol Pot, take control of the party. By the time the Khmer Rouge come to power in 1975, they have a very strong anti-Vietnamese animus, which draws on deeper nationalist sort of animosities. And basically, the Vietnamese eventually, decided that they needed to topple them from power, and they did so with the help of Cambodian rebels who had defected and who were viewed as still loyal to Vietnam. And so that's the people in the current government were among those. But after the overthrow, the United States, because Cambodia had been liberated by the Soviet Union's ally, Vietnam, this was, of course, just 4 years after the ignominious retreat of the U.S. from Saigon and the humiliation of defeat in Vietnam, they continued to support the Khmer Rouge as the legitimate government of Cambodia in the United Nations. They they whipped the votes in the UN to ensure that took place. And they, essentially backed a diplomatic embargo and sanctions against this new government that was in Cambodia that was backed by Vietnam. And this was a period in which the current leader, Hun Sen, came of political age. And so what you have a situation where through the 1980s, the US is playing this sort of realpolitik hardball with the Cambodians and the Vietnamese. This allows the Khmer Rouge to rehabilitate themselves in jungle camps along the Thai border. And a civil war takes place throughout the 1980s. And there's the Khmer Rouge and two other non-communist resistance groups that are backed by the West and by the Chinese. They wage war against the government in Phnom Penh. And this is the civil war that continues all the way through to the end of the 90s. But you have a situation where at the end of the Cold War, when there's a peace settlement in Cambodia that attempts to end the civil war, you have the United States and all these governments starting to talk about the importance of democracy, the importance of human rights, and to lecture the Cambodian government essentially about these questions. After this period in which they made the most squalid moral sort of accommodations with people that were well known by the 1980s to have been involved in these horrific crimes in Cambodia during the 4 years that they were in power. And so the double standards of Western policy toward Cambodia, particularly American policy, is something that is a frequent theme in the complaints of Cambodia's leader and continue to bedevil relations between Washington and Phnom Penh today.
Okay. I got to ask you one final question about the Cambodian genocide because I'm so curious before we move on. Is it true that, I gather the genocide was part of a campaign against the former ruling elite or something. And I've heard the story that they would walk up and hand somebody like a newspaper upside down. And if they knew to turn it right side up, that meant they were literate, so they would kill them because that meant they were educated and part of the ruling class. That sounds like kind of anecdote that could be apocryphal. Have you heard this story?
There's all sorts of anecdotes that are similar to that. Like the knowledge of foreign languages, for instance, was seen as a mark of. I mean, in a very real sense, the Khmer Rouge armies, the young men and women that filled the ranks of this insurgent movement were overwhelmingly rural. Young people. Cambodia at the time was an incredibly poor country. Large regions of the country were essentially isolated from urban life. The infrastructure was so poor in Cambodia at the time that you had, young people who joined the Khmer Rouge, who were indoctrinated, who had never really seen a city or a town, even a provincial town, and were sort of taught to treat people in those areas as parasites, and who had been living off the labor of the peasantry. And so, there was this very strong anti-urban sort of tendency in the Khmer Rouge Revolution, which was, ironically, the ideologues at the top were people who had studied in France and knew Paris well, and were very, this is obviously a paradox that we see in many communist revolutions. But there a lot of those sorts of anecdotes, they might seem extreme, but a lot of them are true. I mean, you hear these stories repeated constantly. That people would seek to hide their levels of education. It would have to sort of pretend to be mute and pretend to be, humble, agricultural sort of workers in order to sort of stay safe, because the Khmer Rouge extolled the peasant as sort of the highest possible, of the repository of revolutionary consciousness, I suppose. It was sort of like an extreme version of Maoism in that respect.
Right. So a lot of your book is about how China exerts power in the region, how these countries respond to that. And Cambodia is related to the one example where in recent times the power has been exerted via actual invasion. The invasion of Vietnam in 1979. That was by China. That was because Vietnam had, as you, I think, said, deposed the Cambodian regime in the late 70s, and that regime had been a client of China's, right?
Essentially, yeah. And the one sort of foreign partner of note that the Khmer Rouge had during their 4 years in power was China. They got all sorts of aid from China, military support. China built infrastructure in the country during that period. It was otherwise very isolated from the rest of the world, but China was its sort of one connection. A little bit of support from North Korea, but very minor. And that's right. The Vietnamese invaded Cambodia Christmas Day, 1978. They overthrew the regime by January 7th and installed their own sort of cadre of Cambodian communists who were Hanoi loyal. And then a few weeks later, the Chinese Deng Xiaoping announced that he wanted to teach the Vietnamese a lesson. He described Vietnam as the Cuba of Southeast Asia, and he sent his armies into northern Vietnam for a campaign. I think it was about a month-long campaign. Actually, the Vietnamese inflicted sort of quite significant losses on the Chinese invading forces, and then they withdrew, having devastated the border areas. It wasn't intended to seize territory in a sort of Ukraine-style scenario. Right. It was more about, as he said, teaching them a lesson, sort of inflicting some pain, reminding the Vietnamese that that they had to take into account that not to challenge Chinese interests and not to go beyond certain lines.
Okay, and though it sounds like all Southeast Asian nations have some degree of wariness of Chinese influence. I mean, for all of them, there's this kind of push-pull thing, right? I mean, there's economic engagement brings benefits. And of course, Chinese power is not something you want to antagonize. On the other hand, you worry about domination. And there's some of that for all of them, but it sounds like Vietnam is one of the wariest to this day of China. Now, why is that? It isn't just Maybe it is. Is it just the memory of the 79 war and the tension then, or what?
I mean, in many ways, Vietnamese national identity only makes sense in the context of China. Vietnam, I mean, the official sort of nationalist narrative that you see in the museums in Vietnam and all that is that Vietnam has resisted Chinese invasions for thousands and thousands of years. And that, its list of victories over Chinese invading forces is quite impressive. One thing that they don't emphasize so much is the extent to which Vietnam, the Vietnamese culture, the Vietnamese state has borrowed from China, how much it's benefited from Chinese military technology, Confucian philosophy, Chinese social structure. A lot of these things have been adopted slowly over the centuries, including during periods of actual Chinese occupation of northern Vietnam, centuries-long periods. And so, the irony at the heart of the Vietnam-China relationship is that, what makes Vietnam so effective at sort of pushing back against China and holding the line is exactly all of the things that it's borrowed from China. And so it's, I think, you can explain it by reference to Freud's idea of the narcissism of small differences. I mean, there's so much that they share. Vietnam is the most Sinitic nation in Southeast Asia, aside from potentially Chinese majority Singapore. And it's sort of, and it's crushed right up against China's southern border. And of course, history has seen a slow southern expansion of China, or what we today call China, the various empires that have occupied that territory. I think that, this has left a very strong mark on Vietnamese national identity. And that's reflected in public attitudes toward China, incredibly hostile and suspicious.
And Vietnam is also one of the most powerful of Southeast Asian nations, right? In terms of economic clout and
it's the third largest by population, but its economy is, I can't remember where it fits in the economic table. I think it's potentially third or fourth largest economy, but it's incredibly dynamic. It's growing very fast. It's recovered from the COVID pandemic. It is a nation with a long history of resisting Chinese, influence and incursion. And so I think that it is viewed by many outside the region as probably, like American policymakers view Vietnam as sort of, an important bulwark, I suppose, against the expansion of Chinese influence, which explains, of course, the flowering relations between Washington and Hanoi over the past, decade or so.
Which is kind of ironic. I mean, for a couple of reasons. The war being one of them, but also the fact that we purport to be organizing our foreign policy around a kind of democracy versus autocracy frame, and Vietnam is not exactly a liberal democracy.
Right. And this, you even had, I think Mike Pompeo, when he was Secretary of State, saying, you can never trust a communist. He making these sorts of comments. And, you just have to wonder how those sorts of things land in Hanoi. And the reality is there is, a kind of conservative, I don't know if you call it a faction of the Vietnamese Communist Party that still views the United States with a certain degree of caution. This idea that ultimately the U.S. wants to undermine communist rule, and through indirect means, through Facebook and Starbucks and American consumer culture, and that ultimately is their goal. They take this rhetoric seriously, even if it's just intended for domestic use. But it's very much the case that human rights as a priority in the U.S.-Vietnam relationship has been systematically downgraded for the past 2 decades.
You mean by the U.S.? Because Vietnam is such an important country to be on good terms with?
Yeah. I mean, it's no longer, it used to be really prominent. I mean, Vietnam was the nation that defeated the U.S. There was this hangover of resentment about that. And issues like religious freedom in Vietnam were, even like during the Bush era, were much more prominent, in Congress. It was constantly being mentioned. But I think it's simply, the emphasis on human rights does tend to vary depending on our, strategic relationship with a particular country. And that's, Cambodia is the opposite, where human rights and democracy promotion are foregrounded in American policy and have become even more emphasized as Cambodia has drifted toward China. And of course, I would argue that the drift toward China has been precisely a result of this emphasis, this foregrounding of human rights issues, and what the Cambodian government views as sort of this condescension and lecturing from the West. But we could talk further about that if you like.
I definitely want to get into that. I want to say, well, first a couple of things. I mean, first of all, so the Communist Party still runs Vietnam, but I gather the situation is kind of like in China, where the name is still Communist Party, but this is not by any means a thoroughly communist country. They have embraced important parts of capitalism, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more accurate to describe China and Vietnam as Leninist. I mean, they believe in the idea of a political party that monopolizes political authority, and that is the sort of vanguard of society and leads society toward socialism, which I guess just means like prosperity and development. So it very much is communist in the sense that the Vietnamese Communist Party demands a monopoly on control and moves quite ruthlessly to stamp out any sign of independent political organization. But you're right that economically they've embraced the market. It doesn't make sense to talk about them as communist in the economic sphere anymore. Mm-hmm. And so there's sort of a weird hybrid of Confucian elements and Leninist political structures and free market capitalism.
Okay, so America is relatively willing to overlook their human rights abuses because we want them to help counterbalance China, which we say we oppose in large part because of their human rights abuses. So, I mean, and I don't want to dwell on the ironies here, but that's kind of the deal there. And I suppose you could defend that by saying, well, but China's a bigger country, so more abuses and so on. Of course, it's also true that we have other issues with China, including the way it throws its weight around the neighborhood. We'll come to that. But let me ask you first, do you think the reason we are less forgiving of the human rights abuses in Cambodia is because just because they're a smaller player, they matter less? Or is it just because they've cozied up to China and so now they're more like part of the problem, or what?
Well, it's actually a pretty complex story. I mean, I think part of it is that Cambodia is has long been viewed as strategically kind of not that important. And so it's a place where we can afford to take a stand on our principles. Myanmar has been described in that way as well. This is a country it's not really that important. So this is somewhere where we can not make these sordid accommodations. As I mentioned earlier, Cambodia was subject of a peace. There was a peace agreement in the early 90s that led to a UN peacekeeping mission. And of course, this took place at the end of the Cold War, a period of liberal optimism, the end of history, all of that. And that sense of optimism really got sort of, attached to the way that Cambodia is viewed from the West. I think there was also a sense that the world owed Cambodia for how the country had suffered, and how they would, kind of like heal the wounds was by bringing the country democracy and all of that. And so, of course, given the sordid accommodations that had been made in the decade previous, this encountered a lot of problems. The government that was in power at the time didn't want to go along with it. But to cut a long story short, I mean, Cambodia has been viewed as a sort of international project by a lot of Western countries. It's a sort of place where, like democracy promotion and human rights promotion has been a dominant part of the policy mix in terms of how these countries engage with it. And so, Hun Sen's government has been forced to kind of deal with this. It's been sort of something that they've had to struggle against in order to consolidate their own power and to win elections and so forth. And as soon as China became economically salient and could feasibly substitute for Western development money, they were very happy to take Chinese money because the Chinese didn't make these demands about good governance and human rights. They didn't have to go through the theater of presenting the progress they'd made on agreed development benchmarks. The Chinese just said, sure, here's $50 million to build a highway. We'll bring our people in, we'll do it. And that looks good on the campaign posters for the CPP, the ruling party in Cambodia. And so, it has been, I think the fact that democracy promotion has been so prominent in the mix in Cambodia since the early 90s has created a strong incentive for the government to look to alternative patrons, which of course they've done. And now that they're close to China, the democracy stuff's being further reinforced and further emphasized as, a reason why the US should impose sanctions on Cambodia, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it shows the risk, I think, of, go on.
Are there sanctions now on Cambodia? Are there US sanctions now?
There's targeted sanctions on key cronies of Hun Sen. And there's been talk about sort of kicking Cambodia out of the generalized system of preferences for trade, like market access for developing countries. And there's been a lot of congressional resolutions calling on the US government to impose harsher sanctions. But it's definitely on the track toward pariah status from the perspective of Washington. And that's been something, that's been discussed a lot recently.
And it sounds like there are at least two reasons for that. One, it's a dinky state, so we can afford to kind of use it for, I don't want, virtue signaling at the risk of sounding too cynical. But anyway, it's a dinky, we can do this without paying a big price, A. And B, closer it gets to China, the more appealing it is politically in the U.S. and the more it seems to fit in a larger project and so on. So it's kind of a self-reinforcing cycle, right?
I mean, it really is. And even the efforts of U.S. ambassadors and American officials that are based in Cambodia to try and rebuild some trust are constantly sort of undermined by the activities of Congress, which is, has always been very hawkish on Cambodia, going right back to the early 90s.
And of course, the more, if sanctions start to, in a big way, reduce the strength of economic connections to the U.S., that only strengthens the relative pull of China and so on, right?
Yeah. It's a pretty, destructive cycle that two countries are caught in right now.
Now, this general issue of Cambodia, kind of, I gather, resenting our preachiness, that's like a general thing in Southeast Asia, I gather from your book. It's like there's kind of, we do a lot of preaching about how you should run your government and how you should treat your people. And there are definitely a lot of cases where I don't personally approve the way the people are treated, but at any rate, the governments in that region tend to wish that we would shut up.
Yeah, I mean, that's the broad sort of dynamic. I mean, you got to remember about Southeast Asian nations is that, all of these nations, bar Thailand, were once colonized by Western powers. And within living memory, I mean, we're talking about, independence coming in the 40s, 50s, and 60s for most of the countries. And so, the sense of national, that inculcated two things. One is sort of a fierce nationalism. The other is a fierce attachment to the norm of national sovereignty. And so nations are very, they get very prickly when they perceive to have been talked down to. And of course, this is one of China's sort of main appeals in the region, is that it will just engage with whoever, and it's not really going to make moral judgments about the particular policies that those governments are making. It will make political judgments about those policies if they are perceived to transgress Chinese interests. But in terms of how you deal with, running an election or whatever, there's not a lot of, not a lot going on there. And so, I mean, I think also the fact that these principles are applied often very unevenly, also, is a source of some consternation in the region.
Vietnam versus Cambodia being one example. The way we treat.
One example, I mean, Cambodia is probably the cardinal example, actually, because it is such a small country that, and I think they really feel like they want to be treated seriously by the world and not just seen as a special, case that all the other rules don't apply to.
And this thing you mentioned, that the history of being colonized leads these countries to kind of not like being preached to. Not that anybody loves being preached to, but it probably reinforces that reaction. And B, to value sovereignty and really resent encroachment on what they perceive to be their sovereignty. These attitudes are shared by China for similar historical reasons. China also sees itself as having been dominated unfairly in the past by abusive Western overlords, right?
Yeah. You see very similar rhetoric around, non-interference and national sovereignty. The paradox in the case of China, of course, is that it is an incipient imperial power. I mean, it does have, it does have that superpower sort of status now, and it almost sort of, so on the one hand, it sort of appeals to the global South, including many of the nations of Southeast Asia, as sort of an anti-colonial elder brother that's going to, and of course, China's anti-colonial claims go back to 1949. I mean, it has this, its involvement in the Bandung Conference of 1955, the non-aligned conference. I mean, it does have a sort of heritage of that engagement with the global South.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I lost my train of thought, but you have that on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you have the fact that China is becoming increasingly powerful. It's building up its navy and its army. It's asserting power into the South China Sea, which brings it into friction with, 4 Southeast Asian nations. And so there's a certain tension in how China engages with the region. On the one hand, it is, it's an understanding sort of partner in the attempt to kind of, free nations from this sort of the domination of Western models, I suppose you would say. And also, it's seen as a threat in other ways. And so it's kind of, there's this, like you say, a sort of push and pull, constant tension and anguish in relations between these two regions.
Right. And so it's a pretty profound irony. I mean, China's on the one hand saying, yes, we share your aversion for similar historical reasons to heavy-handed imperialism. By the way, we are now a heavy-handed imperialist, and they're heavy-handed in the region, as you note. They haven't. There are these disputes about islands. There's this assertion of what is it, the 10 dash whatever. There's some they claim
9-dash line,
the 9-dash line, which has now gone through adjudication in the kind of international tribunal that's appropriate, and China lost, and they said, no, you can't claim territorial authority this far away from your borders, and China said, screw you, right?
Yeah, basically,
They're rejecting the rule. So it's kind of, it's a good example of what people rightly say about America, which is that it preaches rule-based order, and on the other hand, violates the rules. Oh, there's a funny quote. What is it? Well, it has to do with naval power, but it's like we rule the waves and therefore waive the rules, or something. Somebody.
Right. Oh, that was about the British. I think that was the British Navy, the Royal Navy.
Yeah.
That was what was often said about them. Yeah.
Now, there's another interesting phrase. What's it called? Great power autism, which. And of course, it's a kind of an insensitive phrase. I mean, but the point is that one characteristic of autism is sometimes, not a lot of kind of cognitive empathy, not like deep awareness of how the person on the other side is viewing you, not great sensitivity to that, and you're saying that there's an American version of this. You call this a liberal variant of great state autism. There's a Chinese variant of it, and again, that is manifest in them kind of playing rough in ways we can enumerate. But I want to ask you first the question of, that phrase makes this sound like a kind of inevitable or highly expectable product of China just being a rising power. On the other hand, there are people who note that it seems to have gotten worse around the time that Xi Jinping took over, and they attribute it, they might say it's more a contingent fact of his own temperament or aspirations or whatever else. What's your, the wolf warrior diplomacy and this and that? I don't know when exactly that starts, but what's your view on that? To what extent is China kind of throwing its weight around, just a product of its growing stature and power? And to what extent is it a product of the contingent fact of Xi Jinping being the ruler?
I mean, my sense is that it's, China is acting in ways that one would expect from a rising power. I mean, if you look out at Asia from a Chinese vantage point, I mean, it's a very claustrophobic place. You have, American allies, lying like a chain off your, eastern shore. and then you border countries, nuclear armed countries like Russia and India and Pakistan, and the sense Chinese strategists have always had this sort of fear of being encircled and strangled, and I think that's and obviously Taiwan is a very important sort of node in that sort of that chain that they perceive. And I think that, really, given China's reliance on the international trade and access to the global commons, I mean, so the South China Sea, for instance, it's very logical that they would seek, to, if not to control directly, at least to prevent any other country from controlling the sea lanes of communication that go through this region. There's a whole lot of bogus nationalistic sort of myth that has been woven around China's historic claims to these regions. But I think, you just got to see it as there's a certain strategic logic to wanting control of these things. The problem in China's case, which, the United States never really faced to a significant degree, is that it has a lot of powerful neighbors. It's not a country that really can dominate the entire region. I mean, you've got the world's third largest economy, Japan, lying in very close proximity to China, South Korea, both of them U.S. treaty allies. I mean, even a country like the Philippines, it's got a population of more than 100 million people. And, and then obviously India is also a player in the maritime sort of world of the quote unquote Indo-Pacific. And so, yeah, I do think it's pretty much to be expected. And, I don't think it speaks to any particular hunger for military conquest, but I do think that, the risk of military conflict is definitely present, in large part because of the security dilemma that what we perceive as an offensive act, they see as defensive, and vice versa.
Right. What are some examples of things we see as offensive that they might see as defensive?
Well, the militarization of islands in the South China Sea, for instance. I think they would argue that that they have American ships sailing close to their shores, right up in their face. So they would argue that this is not something that any self-respecting great power can accept. And of course, the United States wouldn't accept it either. If
they came within 12 miles of Los Angeles or something.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's actually, the U.S., I don't know, maybe they would accept it, actually. I don't know. I mean,
I don't know what we do about it. It would be a very interesting consciousness raiser, I think, if we...
Yeah. I mean, yeah, and then so I think there is, that's just one sense in which, they, or something like the Belt and Road Initiative, right? I mean, that's, I don't think that they view it as defensive, but they, it is perceived in the West as this sort of like master plan for world domination. And I think that it's, in some ways a little bit more mundane than that.
What are some examples of Belt and Road in Southeast Asia? I mean, you hear the term a lot, and you hear this story about somewhere, supposedly China, they helped build a port, and in the fine print, it had said, if you can't pay this loan back, we get the port. And so now they have the port. I don't think that's in Southeast Asia.
That's in Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the Sri Lankan case has actually been quite widely misreported. I mean, the Chinese didn't, basically the Sri Lankan government was so burdened with foreign debt to other foreign debtors that it leased this port to a Chinese firm in order to raise money to pay back its debts to others. So it wasn't a case of a debt for equity swap in the way that it's being depicted. Look, so in Southeast Asia, the Belt and Road takes many forms. I mean, I think it's useful to see the Belt and Road Initiative as sort of a headline announcement that was made before they really knew what it was all about. And so subsequently, Chinese officials have had to sort of like elaborate what is the Belt and Road and fill in the blanks a little bit. But you see, I think that one thing that predates the Belt and Road that has now been subsumed within it is the deepening economic integration between southern China and mainland Southeast Asia, the nations that directly sort of border China. And so the most recent example is a quite impressive railway that's been built from China's Yunnan province into Laos. So it connects the Lao capital Vientiane to the provincial capital of Yunnan, Kunming. And this is, if you know anything about the terrain of this region, I mean, it's this incredibly rugged karst terrain, very difficult. The roads are horrific and and the Chinese have just, basically bored a railway through the mountains and over bridges. And it costs about $6 billion. And, there's been questions asked about whether it was really worth it. But that's an example of sort of, connecting China to these nations that lie to its south. And that's been something that's a process that's been ongoing for several decades, but has been now under the Belt and Road as sort of continued to advance. And so you have similar infrastructure projects in Myanmar, which connect China's southern provinces to the Indian Ocean that seek like railway, road links, deep sea ports, economic zones on the border of China and neighboring countries that are about, promoting trade.
Takes a lot of these are lower tariff zones or something?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not even really sure in a lot of cases, but they're kind of, they often have like a special economic zone sort of in the border region that can then be used for, investment by Chinese firms. And there's a lot of, it takes a lot of forms, but a lot of these things were happening prior to the Belt and Road Initiative being announced in 2013. And so, it is sort of hard to pin down exactly what it is because it's sort of everything and nothing in a way. And it's actually being...
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say it's actually being sort of, appears to be, some people believe that it's being sidelined a little bit in favor of a new initiative called the Global Development Initiative. So we'll see.
Huh. And that may just be a rebranding. We don't know.
Yeah. Focusing more on development rather than on infrastructure. I mean, it remains to be seen.
And is it possible to characterize like generically what the deal is with Belt and Road Initiative things? Like, does China, as a rule, hope to establish stronger economic ties so that there will be more importing of Chinese goods via these ports and these railroads? And is that part of the deal, or is there? And then what the appeal is? I assume from the countries themselves, they're getting the railroads or the ports or whatever a little more cheaply than in the long run than they would if they had to do it themselves. But I don't know. Is this kind of the basic dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes the rates of interest on Chinese loans are actually higher than say the World Bank. On the other hand, they can be approved very quickly, and so if you have you don't have as many sort of regulatory processes to go through, and you also don't have the accompanying sort of good governance benchmarks that you have to meet. So there is a sort of appeal that Chinese are very good at just getting things going. And, there is a certain appeal there. I think from the Chinese perspective, obviously there's the kind of overarching goal of reinforcing China's economic centrality. It provides alternative, economic connections to the world, because obviously China is very constrained in the maritime. There are maritime choke points that could, if they were to be blocked, could really damage the Chinese economy, like the Malacca Strait. All of these other connections westward toward Europe by land, and also, access to the Indian Ocean, give China sort of additional ways of, sustaining itself economically and increasing its resilience. And then there's simply, the more mundane thing of, China's excess industrial capacity. It needs an outlet. So, building infrastructure abroad is a very good way of, using those stockpiles of steel and concrete and even stockpiles of labor that are idle in China and exporting them abroad. And that, there's a certain, China's political economy has made the Belt and Road Initiative sort of, an attractive way of engaging with the world.
Okay. Now, as you suggested, there's the perception in the U.S. that the Belt and Road Initiative is kind of, I don't know, aimed at the juggler of America or something, right? Ultimately, like there's this goal. I mean, am I exaggerating? Don't you get the sense that some people really, really, and I don't know, maybe they're right, but think that the aim a lot of this is to kind of extinguish America?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it is to, enhance Chinese prestige and credibility and ultimately influence. But, there is a certain faction in Washington, D.C. that anything that China does is automatically viewed in the worst possible light. Whereas if you go to Africa or Southeast Asia, for that matter, I mean, you see a lot of governments who are like, actually, we're a little bit suspicious of the Chinese. We don't really quite we're not drinking the Kool-Aid, but we, they are coming here and actually offering concrete solutions to development challenges that we've had. And when it comes to sort of the debt trap diplomacy, which is a sort of meme that's come about to describe Chinese engagement with the global South, a lot of these countries have plenty of experience with over-indebtedness to Western-dominated institutions like the World Bank, the IMF. They've been subjected to structural adjustment policies going back to the 1960s and 70s. And so the idea that, Chinese economic engagement represents a unique threat is I think, quite rightly viewed as absurd in a lot of these places, even if countries are cautious about engaging with China for obvious reasons.
Okay. And on this, back to this issue of China kind of throwing its military weight around and, occupying disputed islands, creating islands, asserting, expansive territorial authority in the water. First of all, what are can you remind us of the main instances of that with respect to Southeast Asian nations? What are the main, and you can go ahead and throw in Japan and anybody else if you want, but what are the big ones?
Well, so the South China Sea, is really, in terms of China's, friction points with Southeast Asia, that's really the main one. And the South China Sea is contested between China, Taiwan, which sort of almost asserts the same claims as China, given that its history is having viewed itself as the legitimate government of China for a long period. And then you have Malaysia, Brunei, Vietnam, and the Philippines. And Indonesia doesn't consider itself an active claimant, but it does have frictions with China in one small overlapping section of the southern part of the 9-dash line that lies within Indonesia's exclusive economic zone. So they're effectively a claimant as well. That's 5 of the 10 ASEAN nations. And this is basically, these specks of coral, these reefs in the middle of the ocean that, have long been, there have been disputes over these for many years, but have become much sharper since 2009, when China submitted the 9-dash line officially to a UN commission, officially claiming that everything that falls within that loop as sort of Chinese territory or being under China's control, and that immediately sort of touched off bilateral tensions with each of these nations to varying degrees. In Vietnam, there actually were skirmishes that involved, in 1974 and 1988, the Chinese actually seizing control of islands that were occupied in the case of 1974 by South Vietnam, and then in 1988 by the government of Unified Vietnam. And that the latter case involves the killing of Vietnamese personnel. So, these things are, there have been sort of skirmishes over these things. More recently, it's been more about China sailing maritime militia vessels and Coast Guard vessels into areas that it claims that are in the exclusive economic zones of other nations. And so there's been these sorts of standoffs. The Philippine government is constantly issuing diplomatic protests about Chinese incursions into areas that it claims. And so, it's sort of it's a very complex dispute because there are a lot of overlapping claims, even between Southeast Asian nations. And the fact that they have outstanding claims themselves with each other has prevented sort of the creation of a united front against China. China occupies and has, established a presence on some islands, but so have Southeast Asian nations, obviously much smaller facilities given the relative wealth. The Chinese artificial islands are absolutely gargantuan. They have fully functioning airfields, and they could be militarized at a moment's notice, and they could become used in a war very easily.
And so your view is that basically all of China's shenanigans in the South China Sea and, all these things we read about with them throwing their weight around that we view as offensive, China does consider defensive. Just that that it's wise to be cautious and make sure that, is it ultimately the U.S. that they worry about, that they need to establish this border against, or what?
Yeah, essentially, I don't think they worry too much about the Philippines. I
Right.
think that in the case of the Philippines, which is a U.S. treaty ally, I think they view it as essentially a giant American aircraft carrier, and
Right.
they have a difficulty seeing the Philippines as having its own agency and its own national interests that differ in some respects from the United States. I mean, I think to say that it's purely defensive maybe is giving a little bit too much. I think that it's a predictable and logical move given the anxieties of Chinese strategists and the way that they view the region and their fears of Chinese encirclement. And again, it's sort of like the case with Ukraine and Russia and NATO expansion. You don't, you have to emphasize that, this isn't about defending what they're doing, but it's just about trying to create some, to try and fill in some of the thinking that's going into this policy. Another factor, of course, and, that has to be taken into consideration is that the Communist Party in China has committed itself to the notion that these are inalienable parts of China. So it also now has a domestic political reason to dig in and to not to back down. So of course, that domestic dynamic makes all of this much more dangerous because it's not something that can easily be negotiated away.
Right. Now, we talked about the American fear that the Belt and Road Initiative is part of a kind of a global Chinese strategy to, if not destroy America, kind of systematically reduce its influence and ultimately, maybe come close to suffocating it or something. Part of the American fear of China has to do with this idea that it is trying to replicate its model of governance around the world, which is to say autocratic, authoritarian, right. But earlier you said that, China is actually part of its appeal relative to America of some Southeast Asian nations is that it's actually not very judgmental. I mean, it's happy to take you as you are, so long as it sees you as having a constructive relationship with it. And maybe sometimes that it defines constructive as subordinate and accommodating because it's the great power. But the point is, it sounds like it's really not paying a lot of attention to whether you are authoritarian and autocratic. It welcomes all nations that can have what it defines as a constructive relationship with it. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the way I like to conceive it is that China is offering other nations freedom from models, freedom particularly from Western models. It's saying that you don't have to listen to the IMF and the World Bank and the US government and the European Union when they tell you that you must do things this way, that history is ordained, that there is one set of political arrangements that works for every country. It's saying that, look, if you want to adopt the same institutions that we have in China, then I'm sure they wouldn't complain. But I also think that they really, they're pretty agnostic on the question of how countries should organize themselves, so long as, they're pursuing policies that are adjacent to or not in opposition with Chinese interests.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the problems with this democracy-autocracy framing, I think, is that it flattens. It's a very poor way of representing social realities. I mean, there are a lot of countries in Southeast Asia that one would describe as authoritarian in the sense of non-democratic, but that otherwise share very little. I mean, you look at a country like Vietnam, and which has a very strong state and a very strong party. It resembles in many ways the regime in China. And then you look at a country like Cambodia again. It's very fluid. It's a personalist dictatorship. Power is exercised not through state institutions, but, overwhelmingly through patronage connections between key individuals. The state is very weak. It's also, countries that are democratic in the sense that they have elections also can conceal huge injustices in terms of, disparities of wealth and income. I mean, the Philippines is the most dangerous country to be a journalist in Southeast Asia. It's also quite a vibrant democracy. It's got huge amounts of corruption. It is in many ways ineffective. The state is in many ways very ineffective at getting things done. And so if you were a poor person in Vietnam versus the Philippines, it's kind of an open question as to which system you would prefer. I think. And I think that the division between democracies and autocracies is a lot grayer and a lot vaguer than a lot of people like to claim. That's not to defend the one party rule by any means, but it's sort of, viewing this region, you can't just see the nations of the region grouped into these convenient, categories. There's a lot of, and authoritarianism isn't an ideology. I mean, it's there are many different forms of non-democratic government, both in Southeast Asia and the wider world. And I think that the Chinese are simply just very pragmatic about, countries' abilities to transition, to sort of liberal democratic rule. And so that instead of pinning their strategic hopes on, this sort of thing happening, they're much more willing just to work with whoever's there. If a country becomes more democratic, then they'll work with that. If there's a military coup, as in Myanmar, then they'll, regrettably, work with that reality. And I guess the fear, of all of this is that the more that the West sort of reinforces this division, I mean, you've said this before, I think, the more that the Chinese might start to go, well, actually, reinforcing these repressive regimes is actually in our interests now, because you've got Western countries trying to empower the opposition to these regimes, the democratic opposition. And so you might start to see a filtering and a polarization of nations into these two camps. But I don't think it's inevitable, and I don't think the Chinese particularly care. That's not to say that their engagement with authoritarian or non-democratic regimes is not a bad thing. That they're in the same way that American engagement with these countries can often have negative impacts. But I just don't think there's a grand design here. I mean, I think many Americans tend to view China as a kind of mirror image of their own self-perception, as sort of, America is ultimately about, spreading freedom around the world, and the Chinese are like the opposite of that. They're like the Bond villain, who's seeking purely to spread, an evil system around the world. And I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, and we run the risk of creating a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, and it seems like there's a couple of dimensions of that self-fulfilling dynamic. I mean, one, as you suggested, is we may give China an incentive to kind of cultivate the authoritarian, autocratic elements in a country, but we also can give the countries that are authoritarian and autocratic an incentive to move closer to China, right? I mean, if you sanction them, if you just preach to them and seem to be trying to arouse incipient democratic opposition, through the National Endowment for Democracy, whatever else. I mean, you may drive them closer to China, and then we'll say, see, there is a global network of these authoritarian and autocratic nations, right? But it wouldn't be quite as tight a network if we weren't doing the preaching.
Right. And as I said before about in the case of Cambodia, I mean, my argument is that the reason the country is so close to China, I mean, there's a certain geographic logic too, given its situation and its fears of Vietnam. Right. There's a sort of logic in having China as a protector and a sort of something that can keep the Vietnamese in line. But it's also, a reaction to this sort of democracy building project that descended on Cambodia in the early 1990s and which continues to condition Western views of the country. And so
it descended on them from the West, you mean?
The UN peacekeeping mission that came in. But that really initiated a period in which Cambodia was seen as this sort of peace-building, democracy-building project. The country was almost sort of isolated from the mainstream of Asian developments in a weird sense. But yeah, and I think that my view is that it is that dynamic that established back then that accounts for the steady move of Cambodia toward China, rather than they just hate freedom. I think that the motivations of the Cambodian leadership are more complex than that, and the actions of Western governments are more morally ambiguous than that, which I think is true as a whole. I mean, when we talk about this rules-based international order, I think a lot of Southeast Asian nations, there's two factors here. I think one is that they don't view China in the same unequivocally negative sense that many Westerners now view it. And on the other hand, they don't view the United States and its allies in the same, unambiguously positive light that they like to see themselves. And so, these nations have seen American accommodation with dictators in the region. They've seen intervention in Vietnam, incredibly destructive intervention in Vietnam. I don't think, they've seen, especially in the Muslim parts of Southeast Asia, Indonesia and Malaysia, they've seen the American interventions in the Middle East as something that is, that's been hugely unpopular in places like Indonesia. And so I think, their view of both China and the United States is a lot grayer. They resist sort of easy binaries when it comes to the struggle between the two countries. And I think, that the desire to sort of maintain a balance and to avoid committing one way or the other is very much how Southeast Asia is trying to navigate this current tension. Rather than seeing, as this sort of grand struggle between world systems and ideologies, they just want to do business and kind of, avoid being sucked in once again to some sort of great power conflict.
At the same time, the good news about great power conflict is they can play us off of one another, right?
Mm.
We are levers. American involvement is a lever they can use against China and vice versa.
Yeah, and of course Japan as well. Japan being sort of the American ally that does the most to sort of compete with China on the grounds that China's strengths. Infrastructure. The Japanese build huge amounts of infrastructure in Southeast Asia, and they've done so for many years, and are really a preferred partner in some ways because it doesn't come with some of the same strings attached that the Chinese investment does,
and doesn't come with the kind of preachiness you might get from America, or the kind of strings you might get from the IMF. Well,
the Japanese are very thorough when it comes to making sure everything's done very cleanly. They're not into corruption. On the other hand, the Japanese will say that democracy is important, but they're much being, Asian. They don't come out and they don't evangelize.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're much more pragmatic about the complexity of establishing functioning democracies, and that this is something that cannot simply be willed into existence.
Right.
And that, they're much more pragmatic with how they deal with the region. And under Shinzo Abe, who's the late Shinzo Abe, they went very far to sort of advancing this economic diplomacy and really, they became more pragmatic in how they dealt with the region, and including continuing to engage with countries like Myanmar that are, pariah states now, sort of, but are still, China has a lot of influence, and the Japanese are concerned about, losing, ceding this country to Chinese influence totally. So, they've been very pragmatic. But you're right. The Southeast Asian nations have a lot to gain from being courted by various powers. The danger, of course, is that decoupling and the potential for actual conflict also weigh on economic, the sort of economic future of the region. And I think that Southeast Asian leaders would prefer if the U.S. and China just settled all their differences and both sides compromised in order to preserve sort of an environment that was conducive to economic flourishing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's something that either China or the U.S. is willing really to do at the moment. But and so Southeast Asia is being forced to sort of continue with this balancing act.
Uh-huh. And by the way, what are the most democratic countries in Southeast Asia? I mean, maybe leaving aside how liberal that, whether, as you said, the Philippines is kind of an illiberal democracy, but a democracy. What other countries would you call democratic in Southeast Asia?
Well, I mean, you would probably say Indonesia, the Philippines, and Malaysia are like the most democratic, but there are a lot of flaws with these systems. Indonesia's taken an illiberal turn under its current president. The Philippines, obviously under Rodrigo Duterte, and now Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Very illiberal. I mean, huge amounts of disinformation that played into the last election in the Philippines. Malaysia has sort of, is currently in this state where, they had quite a remarkable election in 2018 where the ruling party, UMNO, was kicked out of power for the first time since independence. But then 2 years later, there was some political shenanigans, and that the government collapsed, and now they're back in power, even though they haven't been elected. And there's sort of, you see sort of like signs of progress. They just jailed their prime minister, a former prime minister in Malaysia, for corruption. But you also see, there's a lot of shortcomings of Malaysian democracy. And it's kind of hard to describe any nation in Southeast Asia as being really, clearly a consolidated democracy. And it's probably no surprise, given that these are young nations that are in many ways still kind of working out what their national identities are, let alone, what political systems, they should have. And I think that, it's...
Right.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you want to say that we have democratic partners, you could describe all these nations as democratic. If you wanted to criticize them for not being democratic enough, you could find things to criticize. But aside from those three nations, I mean, you really don't have a lot more. Thailand has gone through periods of being moderately democratic, but now it had 5 years under military rule, and now is under a tightly circumscribed political system controlled or backed up by the military and the monarchy. So, yeah, I mean, it's a pretty grim times, honestly. But yeah, it's. I
mean, I guess one thing is that the effects of colonialism began a long time ago in the region, right? I mean, you've got the Dutch, you've got this, you've got that. And I guess when that starts is a period where there weren't many democracies in the world, period, right? So
right.
I don't know. I mean, what you might call the indigenous form of governance of these countries, the pre-colonial form of governance is, of course, not democratic, And then the colonialism, I don't know, ends at various times in various places, but in some places pretty recently.
It creates, I mean, in a lot of countries, colonialism created, ethnic hierarchies, for instance, where they hadn't existed before. Like in Myanmar, the British colonists raised up ethnic minorities in order to kind of divide and rule and to keep the ethnic Burma or Burman majority down. What happened after independence is that it flipped. The ethnic Burman majority now controls the military and the central organizations of the state, and it's been in a state of constant civil war since. And then in Malaysia, you had the British bringing in huge numbers of ethnic Chinese and ethnic Indians to work the plantations and the mines.
Right.
And then that, created a sort of, ethnic, again, a sort of ethnic stratification, which persists to the present in Malaysia, where the Malays benefit, they're majority, but they benefit from affirmative action, which, is designed to sort of reduce the economic power of the Chinese minority. And that, look, one thing we haven't even spoken about, which is hugely important in terms of Southeast Asian nations' perceptions of China, is China's relationship to ethnic Chinese diasporas in each of these countries. And that's something that I think is more of a concern for a lot of Southeast Asians and Southeast Asian governments than sort of military invasion by the Chinese Navy or what have you.
So somebody called the Chinese the Jews of the East, meaning that there is a diaspora. They've been economically successful in a number of countries. They are resented in a number of countries, and so on. Right? Vietnam, and there have been reactions against that. The mass expulsion of Chinese and so on. Ethnic Chinese are a majority in Singapore, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, yeah. So I was just going to say that you have a couple of things. China's support for communism, which was sometimes, as in the case of Malaya, involved a communist movement that was Chinese majority, because the Malayan Communist Party that fought against the British and then against the early Malayan government early on was dominated by ethnic Chinese, and that ultimately explained why it failed, because it didn't have that much purchase in Malay communities and Indian communities, whereas the Vietnamese communists had national legitimacy and they represented or could claim to represent everybody, and so the application of lessons from the Malayan context into the Vietnamese context didn't play out the same way. You had that question. And then there's also, China going back to before the People's Republic the Qing dynasty, the Republic of China after 1911, both of these governments or states claimed overseas Chinese as citizens on the basis of blood. And so any Chinese living abroad was ultimately a subject of the Chinese Empire or the Republic. And the communist government inherited this. This is not something that, that they originated, this idea that the Chinese state represents all Chinese, no matter where they may live or no matter how long they may have lived there. But and then the Chinese government has made efforts to sort of create a division between Chinese citizens and Chinese people with Chinese ethnicity that have foreign citizenship. But, as I describe in the book, recently Xi Jinping has started to sort of blur those lines and create to sort of try to enlist overseas Chinese communities in Chinese state projects, and so, to kind of garner support from them. And that, is a pretty dangerous development, because in a lot of parts of Southeast Asia, ethnic Chinese have struggled to be accepted as legitimate members of the nation.
Right.
And if they have been accepted, it's been a long process of acceptance. And to be seen as sort of like ultimately puppets of the PRC could be potentially very dangerous, given the history of violence.
It's a little like the dual loyalty allegation or suspicion that some Jews face.
Right, and the Jews of the East was the Thai king who made that comparison in the early 20th century. He was making it, saying that that's bad, Jews are bad, and he was drawing on anti-Semitic tropes then dominant in Europe. But there is a lot of similarities, and scholars of diasporas have studied the Jews and the Chinese, have done comparative studies between the two, because there are a lot of similarities in how they relate to the majorities of the nations that they live within.
Okay. Well, listen, it's a really interesting book. It covers a lot. We could talk a long time, and we've already talked a fair amount of time. Let me kind of close by asking, how America, assuming that you, say you're an American president, and you have a kind of a realistic view of competitive threats posed by China. You're not, you don't misguidedly think that the Belt and Road Initiative is actually a plan to plant the seeds of autocracy everywhere and ultimately smother America and send Chinese aircraft carriers over and so on. But it's there is such a thing as real competition for influence. How should we view Southeast Asian nations? And of course, you emphasize, these are not monolithic by any means. They're not homogeneous by any means. At the end of the book, you say that the Association for Southeast Asian Nations is never going to be this extremely cohesive thing. They have differing interests, different relationships with China in particular, and so on. But there are certain shared things. They all share some degree of wariness of China. I would think that from America's strategic point of view, that's potentially a kind of asset, right? If you want to, to in a reasonable way counter Chinese influence, keep it from getting out of control, keep it from becoming inimical to your own economic and strategic interests. I would think the wariness of Southeast Asia is an asset. Is there any kind of generic advice you'd give America about how to think about this?
Well, I think that's true. I think that what Southeast Asian nations want from the United States is they do want the U.S. to remain engaged in the region. They do want there to be a counterweight to China, both a security counterweight, which mostly already exists, and an economic counterweight. They want a balance of foreign relations that maximizes their autonomy and reduces the likelihood that they'll be sort of sucked into a vassal-like relationship with any outside power. So I think that, what you say about them all having this sense of threat about China, which is an asset for the US, also has to be balanced against the flip side of proximity, which is that they are incredibly economically entwined with China, and that China is really, central to the region's future prosperity. And so any American engagement with the region cannot be conducted along zero-sum lines. asking nations to choose one way or the other is not going to end well. And I think that I think basically what the US is lacking in Southeast Asia right now, and I'm not the first person to observe this, of course, is an economic strategy. I mean, America has been economically engaged in the region. American businesses have manufactured things in Southeast Asia for many years, but the political economy of the region is now centered on China. I mean, China is the leading trade partner, I think, of 9 of the 10 ASEAN nations. And it's becoming increasingly important as an investor in the region. I think it still might be number 2 to Japan, but we're talking about and influxes of Chinese nationals, expatriates to the region have increased. Although the zero COVID thing has put pause to that, but we'll leave that to one side. The problem in the United States is that while the Chinese are involved in the RCEP trade agreement, U.S. domestic politics is incredibly hostile to the idea of free trade agreements. And so taking steps like the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership that Barack Obama negotiated and then that Trump withdrew from on his first day in office, that is not politically feasible anymore for the US to do that. And so what they've done instead is come up with this thing called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is sort of like trying to have a trade deal without having a trade deal. I mean, it is premised on sort of partnerships for like resilient supply chains and for economic and environmental and social standards and those sorts of things. But it really doesn't offer anything in terms of market access because that's politically poisonous. And so economic engagement really is, I think, the vacuum at the heart of American policy towards Southeast Asia right now. And offering Southeast Asian nations like a meaningful economic sort of lure, I think makes sense. But it's something that's incredibly challenging right now. Even Feigenbaum, who works for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, I think it's called. Yep. I mean, he has a phrase. He says, Asia is about addition and multiplication, not subtraction and division. And so I think that trying to kind of pull down the Chinese and sort of take shots at what they're doing and criticize what they're doing as bad or evil or whatever isn't really going to get the US anywhere. There needs to be a positive vision for the region that is that takes into account how Southeast Asian nations view the world and what their priorities are. They're not always going to line up with what American priorities are, but you need to work with the realities that are there. And I think that the desire of these countries to sort of secure their economic futures is, that's a lot of leaders in the region. That's what they're most concerned about. Their legitimacy, if they're not a fully democratically elected leader, often depends on that. And so, I think that would be my broad advice. But this is something that people in the State Department are already aware of. I just think that they are encountering too many political headwinds at home to make this sort of approach feasible.
And some of them, their own administration is probably creating. But right, COVID and Trump, COVID plus Trump was a real turning point. It seems to me, with respect to relations with China, and then and maybe both, but certainly Trump with respect to free trade issues more broadly.
Yeah. And one other element of the Trump era has sort of this backward-looking sort of idealization of the past, I think, in the US, that people tried to cling on to what was in the wake of the shock of Trump's victory. There was this sense of trying to idealize what had come before. So this is when you really see the international liberal order and the rules-based international order start to be talked about in a really widespread way, this backward idealization of American, and I think that constant looking backwards to and replaying of the greatest hits is really characterized American, foreign policy over the last 6 years. And maybe, the broader advice is to have sort of a more forward-looking policy that tries to create something new rather than simply sort of talking about, restaging the Cold War and dusting off all those old analogies and all that old rhetoric. Because, it is a different world and arguably much more complex world.
Okay, well, the book is In the Dragon Shadow, Southeast Asia in the Chinese Century. I recommend it. And where can people go to find your kind of day-to-day journalistic work?
So I work for a magazine called The Diplomat, I'm the Southeast Asia editor, and so we're at thediplomat.com. I also tweet. I'm not super active on Twitter. I find that it's sort of like uncompensated labor in a lot of ways. But I'm at @sstrangio, SSTRANGIO on Twitter. And yeah, I mean, my books are available from all the usual outlets, and people can check them out.
Okay, and I am at Robert Writer on Twitter, as long as we're talking about things like that. Well, thanks for taking the time. What time is it in Australia right now?
10:30 in the morning.
10:30 in the morning. Okay. Well, it's 9 p.m. here. So I should, do whatever it is I'm supposed to do at this time of night. But thanks so much. Really enjoyed the book. And
Thanks, Bob.
and we'll keep an eye on your work. Take care.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.